The Mississippi River system drains 40% of the continental United States, runs through 31 states, and moves more than 660 million tons of cargo every single year. Think about that for a second. 40% of the country. All of it flowing toward one river. The Mississippi River Basin produces 92% of all United States agricultural exports, and 78% of the world's exports of feed grains and soybeans. This is not a transportation route. It is the backbone of how the planet gets fed. When you buy bread at the grocery store, there is a very good chance the wheat inside it passed through this river. When the world buys American soybeans from China to Egypt, from Bangladesh to Mexico, those soybeans left through New Orleans, loaded onto barges that rode the Mississippi all the way down. The port of New Orleans alone handles 43% of all bulk agricultural exports from the United States and serves as the direct link between the Corn Belt and global buyers. It is one of the greatest competitive advantages this country has ever built, silent, invisible to most people, and functioning for more than 2 centuries without anyone having to think too hard about it. That is the problem. Nobody was thinking about it, because while the country was not paying attention, the river started changing. Not all at once. Not with a catastrophic flood or a disaster that dominates the news cycle for a week, but in a way that is much harder to accept, slowly, quietly, year after year. The level of the Mississippi, measured by the United States Geological Survey at Memphis, has fallen below the zero reference point during harvest season in 8 of the last 10 years. 8 out of 10. That is not a drought anymore. That is a pattern. And 2025 marks the 4th consecutive year the river has hit critically low levels at exactly the moment Midwest farmers need it most: harvest. Here is the paradox this documentary is going to investigate. The most important river in America, the one that sustains the largest agricultural machine on Earth, is failing repeatedly, predictably, and on the record. And the question that no one in power is answering clearly is this: if this has happened for years in a row, what exactly makes anyone believe the 5th year will be different? There's a detail about the Mississippi that most people do not know, and it explains everything. The river you see in Louisiana, the one that passes New Orleans and empties into the Gulf of Mexico, is not fed by Louisiana rain. It is not fed by Mississippi, Arkansas, or Tennessee. When it comes to low water on the lower Mississippi, the rain that falls in those states has very little to do with it. That is because most of the water in the lower Mississippi comes from rivers much further north. By the time the Ohio River meets the Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois, 90% of all the water has already entered the main channel. 90%. That means the fate of the Mississippi is decided hundreds of miles to the north, in the Ohio River Basin and the upper Midwest. And that is exactly where the problem began. In September 2025, the Ohio River was contributing only 8% of its typical flow to the lower Mississippi. Compared to its normal 50% contribution, half the river disappeared. And without that water, what remains of the Mississippi becomes too shallow to support the transportation system that moves American agriculture. When the river drops, barges run aground. It is that simple. One barge can carry the same amount of cargo as 15 rail cars or 58 semi-trucks. That is why the system exists. It is cheap, it is efficient, it is what keeps the price of American grain competitive on the global market. But when the water disappears, that efficiency disappears with it. Barges have to carry less weight to avoid scraping the riverbed. Carrying less means making more trips means more cost. And more cost means one thing for the farmer in Iowa or Minnesota: less money for what they produced. Barge restrictions on the lower Mississippi have already triggered steep declines in grain traffic. In just over a month, total southbound grain shipments on the river fell from 2.4 million short tons to 502,000. A 79% drop in weeks. But there is something worse than grain that cannot reach the market. When the river dries out enough, the Atlantic comes in, literally. When freshwater flow drops below a certain level, salt water from the ocean migrates upstream along the riverbed, which sits below sea level throughout the entire length of Louisiana. The denser salt water sinks below the river's freshwater and pushes slowly northward. This is called a saltwater wedge, and it is no longer a rare event. In recent years, the wedge has appeared around August or September and retreated by November, though the 2023 saltwater wedge did not retreat until January 2024. What used to happen once a decade is now an annual visit. In 2022, 2023, and 2024, 3 consecutive years of saltwater intrusion into a river that supplies drinking water to entire communities. In 2023, the presence of saltwater that far up the river contaminated drinking water for months, forcing residents to buy bottled water and replace appliances damaged by the salinity. Even after the water was declared safe, people were still afraid to drink from their own taps. Think about that. People living on the banks of the greatest river in America, afraid to drink water from the faucet. Not in a developing country. Here, and the solution the government found. The Army Corps of Engineers builds a temporary underwater barrier called a sill to block the saltwater advance. In 2022, the Corps spent just over $5 million building that barrier. A temporary barrier, one that has to be rebuilt every year. One that does not protect every community. One that treats the symptom without touching the cause. One unfortunate consequence of the constant dredging needed to keep barges moving is that the river becomes even more vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. Deepening the riverbed gives the salt water more room to push in, solving one problem while making another one worse. That is the pattern this documentary keeps finding in every block. Every solution creates a new problem. Every repair buys time, and time is getting more expensive every year. Iowa farmer Paul Freeman, trying to figure out what to do with his 2025 soybean crop, puts it better than any federal report can. Normally, he would put his beans on the river and export them to Europe, but barge rates are not favorable. He would typically send them to China, historically the biggest buyer of American soybeans, but the country is boycotting United States beans amid a trade war. River broken, market broken, at the same time. That is what the system looks like when it starts failing on multiple fronts simultaneously. And the question that hangs in the air, unanswered, is this: if the river runs low every fall right when the harvest needs to move, and it took for consecutive years for anyone to call it a pattern, what exactly is it going to take before we call it by its real name? Block 2 showed you what happens when the river runs dry. This is about what happens when it does not. Because here is the part that does not make the news cycle, the part that builds slowly, invisibly, while everyone is watching the water levels on the weather application. The Mississippi River is not just running out of water. It is also being poisoned by the very farms it was built to serve. Every spring across the Corn Belt, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, Missouri, rain falls on millions of acres of cropland. That rain picks up what is on the surface: fertilizer, manure, nitrogen, phosphorus. And because that is what those fields are covered in, that is what the water carries when it runs off into streams and tributaries. From those streams into the river, and from the river all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Crops take up on average just 40% of the nitrogen applied each season. The excess runs off into waterways, leading to a massive nutrient load in the Mississippi River. 40%, that means 60% of every pound of fertilizer applied to Midwestern fields is essentially wasted, and most of it ends up in the water. That runoff travels to 1,000 miles, and when it finally reaches the Gulf, it does not disappear. It feeds an explosion of algae. The algae blooms, covers the surface, blocks sunlight, then dies. As it sinks and decomposes, bacteria consume it and use up all the oxygen in the process. What is left behind is a zone of water where oxygen levels drop so low that fish cannot survive, shrimp flee, crabs die. The seafloor goes silent. That zone has a name. In 2024, scientists supported by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration measured the Gulf of Mexico dead zone at approximately 6,705 square miles, the 12th largest on record in 38 years of measurement. That is more than 4 million acres of habitat potentially unavailable to fish and marine life. An area roughly the size of New Jersey, dead every summer. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is the second largest dead zone in the world, and it is directly caused by the levels of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution flowing out of the Mississippi River. This is not a natural disaster. It is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, moving nutrients from farms to markets, and the cost of that system is being paid at the other end, by the Gulf, by fishing communities, by anyone who depends on what comes out of those waters. United States farmers account for roughly 10% of global fertilizer use, behind only China and India. But while those nutrients are designed to feed crops, The nitrogen and phosphorus that end up in waterways create severe health problems for people and ecosystems downstream. And the data on what is happening to the water itself is hard to ignore. In Minnesota alone, state authorities found that nitrogen levels in major rivers, including the Mississippi, increased from 21% to 55% over a 20-year period. That is not a bad year. That is a trend moving in one direction. Sylvia Secchi, a natural resource economist at the University of Iowa, put it plainly, government agencies tell you they are spending all this money, therefore they must be doing something right. But if you look at the actual water quality data, at what is really happening, it is getting worse, not better. That is a professor at a public university in Iowa describing the official response to one of the most documented environmental crises in the country. Now go further down the river, past Memphis. Past Baton Rouge, Cancer Alley is an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, home to more than 200 petrochemical plants and refineries, reportedly the largest concentration of such facilities in the Western Hemisphere. These plants sit on what were once plantation sites, and they border what are now predominantly black communities. Communities of color in this corridor experience between 7 and 21 times higher emissions rates, depending on the pollutant, than predominantly white communities elsewhere. Nearly every census tract in Cancer Alley ranks in the top 5% nationally for cancer risk from toxic air pollution. The Mississippi does not just carry fertilizer runoff from the top of the country. By the time it reaches its mouth, it is also carrying the industrial discharge of one of the most chemically saturated corridors in the Western world. And here is where both problems, the drought and the pollution, collapse into the same bitter irony. The farms that need the river to move their grain are the same farms polluting the river with the runoff from the fertilizer they use to grow that grain. The industrial corridor that processes what the river carries is poisoning the communities living on its banks. And the government task force created in 1997 specifically to fix the dead zone has spent billions of dollars over nearly 3 decades. Yet the 5-year average size of the dead zone today stands at more than twice the target goal set for 2035, nearly 30 years. Billions of dollars, the problem is twice as bad as where it needs to be. That is not a failure of awareness. Everyone involved knows exactly what is happening. That is a failure of will and an ongoing decision made every year to let the river absorb the cost of a system that benefits everyone except the river itself. The question is not whether anyone can see it. The question is who is paying attention long enough to demand something different. Let us talk numbers. Because this is where it stops being an environmental story and becomes something every American has a stake in, whether they have ever seen the Mississippi River or not. By the end of 2022, the Mississippi River drought is estimated to have cost the United States $20 billion in lost economic output, $20 billion in a single year. From one river running low, that is not a projection. That is not a worst-case scenario modeled by a research institute. That is a documented economic loss from one drought event on one waterway, in a country that has now watched that same waterway fail for years in a row. During the 2022 event alone, agricultural exports via Louisiana ports fell 3.9%, about $565 million in just the second half of the year. And the damage does not stop at the port, it travels all the way back to the farm. When barges cannot move, grain elevators get backed up. When elevators get backed up, they lower what they will pay farmers. That spread between what a farmer expects to receive and what they actually get at the local elevator is called basis. And when the river fails at harvest time, basis collapses. In markets within 5 miles of the nearest Mississippi River port, the basis weakened by 58 cents per bushel during the 2022 low water event. On millions of bushels across thousands of farms, that is not a rounding error. That is a farm family's margin, gone. And the problem does not just run downriver, it runs back upstream too. United States inland waterways save shippers an estimated $7 to $9 billion every year compared to rail or truck alternatives. That cost advantage is what allows American farmers to compete globally against Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine. When the river goes down, that advantage erodes. And America's competitors do not wait. They step in and fill the orders that United States exporters cannot fulfill on time. Now add what is happening beneath the surface. The locks and dams on the upper Mississippi River were estimated to have a 50-year lifespan when they were constructed in the 1930s. They are now approaching 90 years of age. The average delay at locks tripled between 2010 and 2020. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave the country's inland waterways a grade of D+ on its infrastructure report card. A D+ on the infrastructure that moves the food that feeds the world. The Army Corps of Engineers carries over $1 billion in known deferred maintenance on the Mississippi Valley Division alone, a backlog the system simply does not have the funding to address. And the consequences of that inaction are not theoretical. A 30-day closure at a single lock near St. Louis would result in a $3 billion reduction in national gross domestic product and jeopardize more than 15,000 jobs across 5 states. Extend that closure to 180 days and national losses rise to $15.2 billion. One lock, 30 days, $3 billion. There are 29 locks on the upper Mississippi alone, most of them original equipment from the Roosevelt era, running on components designed for a river carrying far less cargo than it carries today. This is where the 3 crises in this documentary converge into one. The river is drying out from drought. It is being poisoned by agricultural runoff, and the physical infrastructure holding the whole system together is failing quietly, year after year, held together by an Army Corps budget that does not come close to covering what the river actually needs. And yet, nothing structurally has changed. A multi-state, multi-agency task force was created in 1997 to address nutrient pollution in the Mississippi. Since then, billions of dollars have been spent. The goal was to reduce the dead zone to 1,900 square miles by 2035. The current 5-year average is more than twice that target. Congress authorized a major navigation improvement program for the river's locks in 2007. Not a single construction dollar has ever been allocated for it. Read that again. Authorized in 2007. No money ever allocated, 17 years later. That is not bureaucratic delay. That is a choice, repeated, annually, across multiple administrations and multiple legislative terms. A choice to keep the river on life support rather than deal with what it would actually cost to fix it. The people who depend on this river, farmers in Iowa, barge pilots in Memphis, shrimp fishermen in Louisiana, communities along Cancer Alley drinking water that flows through an industrial corridor, none of them made that choice. They are just living with it. Here is what the data tells us. Stripped of all the policy language and agency reports, the Mississippi River is the single most important piece of infrastructure in American agriculture. It is drying out at harvest time for years in a row. It is being overwhelmed with pollution from the farms it serves. Its physical infrastructure is nearly a century old and failing. The government has known about each of these problems for decades, spent billions attempting to address them, and by every measurable metric. The situation is getting worse, not better. That is the story of the Mississippi River in 2025. Not a disaster that happened. A disaster that is happening, slowly, incrementally, documented in agricultural reports, oceanic forecasts, and engineering inspection logs that almost nobody reads. The river does not need a eulogy, not yet. But it needs something this country has struggled to give it for a very long time, a real answer.